Have you ever thought about, like, how one tiny detail could change everything? What if you missed a phone call? Could it set off a chain reaction, changing history?
It's crazy to think about, right? Like butterfly effect stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Today we're diving deep into this terrifying terrorist attack. It happened in Endeavour Hills, Australia, back in 2014.
Yeah, this is a case where split-second decisions, just like you were saying, really did have huge consequences, life-altering consequences.
And to kind of get a handle on all this, we've got these interviews with two police officers. They're referred to as Officer A and Officer B.
Yeah, they were the ones that came face to face with this radicalized young man, Newman Hayter.
And just hearing them talk about it, the firsthand accounts, it gives you a real sense of how intense that day was and the impact, the lasting impact of that kind of trauma.
Trauma like that stays with you, you know?
Absolutely. So to really get this, we got to go back to 2014. The world was dealing with, like, the rise of ISIS, and their propaganda was everywhere.
Yeah, it was reaching all these like vulnerable young men all over the globe, and Australia wasn't, immune to that.
Right.
The prime minister at the time, he'd even issued warnings like, hey, there's a threat of homegrown terrorism here.
Wow.
And then just days before this attack, a fatwa was issued, like specifically calling for attacks on police officers.
So it wasn't like this distant threat. It was very real, very
Oh,
immediate.
yeah, this was a direct call to violence
Yeah.
against, the people who are supposed to protect us.
Kind of scary to think about that, that atmosphere, like everyone's on edge.
Oh, for sure.
So can you tell us more about this Newman Hayter?
Yeah, so he was 18 years old, and he was already on the radar of, counterterrorism authorities.
What's he doing?
His online activities, and he was associated with some extremist groups. There were, like, warning signs.
Like what?
Well, there was this incident where he got questioned by the police because he was waving an ISIS flag at a shopping mall.
So not just online stuff. This was out in the open.
Yeah, and I mean, it wasn't just some kid being rebellious, right? This was like a public statement. Like,
Yeah.
he was aligning himself with this dangerous ideology.
So were people trying to help him? Like, to get him away from this?
It seems like his parents were really worried about him, so I'm sure they were twitting. But then his passport application got rejected, for security reasons.
I bet that didn't help.
Probably made him feel even more isolated and frustrated,
All right.
And then there was this other thing, this really chilling detail that came out later.
What was that?
There was a recorded phone call where Newman actually talked about, like, wanting to hurt police officers. But the crazy thing is, nobody processed that information in time.
Oh, wow. A missed phone call. And
Yeah.
it could have changed everything.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, what if? What if things had gone differently?
Yeah. So how did these two officers, Officer A and Officer B, how did they end up in this situation with Newman?
So they were assigned to approach him to try and, figure out what was going on. And they started by going to his parents' house.
To talk to them?
Yeah, I think they wanted to understand the situation better, see if they could maybe de-escalate things.
That makes sense.
And they were hoping to have a conversation with Newman, too. But they figured that, talking to him in front of his parents might not be the best way to assess the risk he posed.
Right. Like, he might not be totally honest or open.
Exactly.
So it sounds like they were in a tough spot, trying to protect the public, but also, trying to figure out what was going on with Newman.
Yeah, walking a tightrope.
So what did they do?
They called him,
Mm.
and he agreed to meet them.
Okay. Where?
At first, he said he'd meet them at the police station.
Okay.
But then, and this is where things get tragic, they decided to meet him outside instead.
Oh. Why would they do that?
I guess they thought it might be less confrontational, Like a chance to connect with him, maybe on a more personal level.
But wouldn't that also make them more vulnerable? Especially with, how he'd been acting.
You're right, it was a risk. But they were pros, they were trained,
Yeah.
and, they only had so much information to go on. Plus, they really wanted to de-escalate the situation. It was a judgment call, made in a high-pressure situation.
Right. So they meet Newman outside the station. What happens next?
Everything changed in a flash, like just like that. Newman lunged at Officer A with a knife.
Oh, my gosh.
They struggled, it was frantic. Officer A fell, and Newman just kept attacking.
That's terrifying.
It is. But even in all that chaos, their training kicked in. Like, Officer A, he instinctively covered his firearm when he fell.
Wow. Adrenaline must have been pumping.
Oh, absolutely. It was a bad injury. Officer A ended up with a severed nerve in his arm, his left arm, like the ulnar nerve. It really affected his mobility, and how well he could use his hand.
Oh, wow, that's awful.
Yeah, and that was just from that first attack. He also got some, like, cuts on his wrist from blocking more blows.
So Newman was really trying to hurt him.
Oh, yeah, and Officer B, he was in a really bad spot, too.
What happened to him?
So Newman, he was just, like, filled with this rage it's hard to even understand. He turned on Officer B.
With the knife.
Yeah, and it, like, barely missed his heart. Just a centimeter. A centimeter.
Oh, my God. That's so close.
It's unbelievable he survived, right? He also had these, like, 2 slashes on his face and 2 stab wounds in his shoulder.
It's hard to even picture how chaotic and terrifying that must have been. Were there any witnesses? Like, did anyone see this happening?
Yeah, people started coming out. There's this one guy, he lived nearby, and he called for help right away.
I bet the scene was just, like, horrific. 2 officers down, blood everywhere.
Yeah, and a young man shot.
This all happened right outside the police station, right?
Mm.
Did the other officers inside know what was going on?
Seems like there was a delay in their response. It's kind of, can you imagine? Officer B, even with all his injuries, he managed to, like, run inside and tell everyone what was happening.
Wow.
2 trained officers ambushed right outside their own station.
In broad daylight. It's chilling. So what about the officers? What were they thinking? Like, once the ambulances arrived, how are they doing?
Both of them have talked about how it's almost like you detach from reality when something that traumatic happens.
Really?
Yeah, the adrenaline, it just takes over. So at first, they didn't even feel the pain.
Wow.
Like Officer A, even though he was bleeding a lot, his main focus was on, like, securing the crime scene.
He was still thinking about his job
Yeah.
in that moment.
Yeah, like his detective training kicked in. He wanted to make sure everything was done right, because he knew there would be an investigation.
It's amazing that he could even think about that, with everything that was happening.
I think it shows how dedicated he was to his job.
Yeah.
But it also kind of shows the pressure these first responders are under. Like, they have to appear strong and in control even when things are really bad.
I never thought about that.
Yeah. So Officer B, his experience was a little different.
How so?
Well, as the adrenaline wore off, the pain started hitting him.
Of course.
And he's talked about feeling confused, like he couldn't really process what had just happened, how brutal it was.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the psychological impact of all that.
It's huge. And it wasn't just the officers who were affected. Their families, the other officers at the station, the witnesses, everyone who saw it, it had a huge impact on them, too.
You're right. It's like this ripple effect.
Exactly. So both officers were taken to the hospital.
Right. What was their recovery like? Both physically and mentally, I mean.
Physically, it was really tough. They both had to have multiple surgeries, and they were in the hospital for a long time.
Wow.
Officer A, because of that severed nerve, he had to go through a lot of rehab. And there was a chance that, his arm might never be the same.
That's so sad.
And Officer B, he was dealing with the pain of his injuries and the shock of almost dying.
And the trauma, I bet.
Yeah, the mental and emotional scars, they can take a long time to heal. So the question is, how did they cope with all that? Did they have support?
I hope so.
Well, their stories kind of go in different directions here.
Really? How?
Officer A, I think he was driven by this sense of duty,
Oh.
and maybe he needed to feel like he was back in control. So he went back to work after 3 months.
3 months? Wow.
Yeah, and he got promoted to sergeant and assigned to a uniform station. But later on, he admitted that he was struggling with burnout.
I could see how that would happen.
Yeah, and he was also disillusioned with the police force. Like, he saw things that he thought were safety lapses, and it made him frustrated.
Like, they weren't taking the dangers seriously enough.
Yeah, something like that.
So he was pushing himself to get back to normal life, but maybe he wasn't really dealing with the trauma.
It's common, especially with first responders.
Yep.
There's this pressure to be tough, to bounce back quickly. Admitting that you're vulnerable, that you need help, that can be seen as a weakness in that culture.
It shouldn't be that way.
No, it shouldn't. But anyway, Officer B had a different experience.
What happened with him?
Yeah, he took more time off work to, focus on his recovery,
Makes sense.
both physical and emotional. He was dealing with PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks.
Sounds rough.
Yeah, and he had this, like, deep anger that was really hard to deal with. It strained his relationships,
I bet.
especially his marriage. They ended up getting divorced.
Oh, that's so sad.
And then he also had to deal with all the investigations and the inquest after the shooting.
Yep. I can't imagine that was easy.
No, not at all. So here you have these 2 officers, same traumatic event, but they're on totally different paths to healing.
It's amazing how that works,
Yeah.
like how people process trauma so differently.
Yeah, it shows that there's no one right way to heal,
Hmm.
It's different for everyone. It
Oh.
depends on your personality, the support you have, the resources you can access.
The important thing is that they both got the help they needed, right?
Exactly. Recognizing that you need support, that's huge,
Hmm.
and then finding healthy ways to cope.
So what else stood out to you about their journeys?
Well, it's inspiring to see how they both, like, even with all the struggles, they found ways to help others.
Really?
Yeah. Officer A, he got involved in community work. He joined his daughter's primary school council.
That's great.
Yeah, he wanted to use his skills to give back, but in a different way.
I like that.
He also joined the Australian Bravery Association. It was like he found his tribe.
Yeah, connecting with people who understand what you've been through, that could be so powerful.
Absolutely. So what about Officer B? How did he find his way back?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Well, there was this one moment, a really powerful moment.
What happened?
It was during this medal presentation ceremony.
Okay.
And he just got overwhelmed with emotion. He started crying right there in front of everyone. His
Yeah.
son was there, a whole crowd of people.
That's brave.
It was. And his psychologist had actually encouraged him to, like, let those feelings out.
To not hold it all in.
Yeah, because there's this idea, especially for men, that showing your emotions is weak.
Oh, I know.
But he was able to break through that.
By being vulnerable.
Exactly.
That's so powerful.
It is. And after that, he started letting his family and friends support him. He was able to lean on them.
Good.
And he also found love again, a new partner.
That's great.
She's been amazing, super supportive.
So both officers, even though they took different paths, they found a way to use their experiences to help others.
Right. Officer A through community work and the Bravery Association, and Officer B through sharing his story and talking about mental health.
It's like by focusing on others, they were able to heal themselves.
It's pretty amazing. It reminds us that even when things are really bad, there's always a chance for growth.
Okay, so what's the takeaway from all this? What have we learned from this deep dive into the Endeavor Hills attack?
I think it's a story about, what it means to be human, the good and the bad.
Yeah.
It shows us how important the little things are, like that missed phone call or a single word. They can change everything.
Right. And we also saw the impact of trauma.
Yeah, it doesn't just affect the person who goes through it. It affects everyone around them, families, friends, everyone.
And it reminds us how resilient people can be.
Exactly. You can go through something awful, but you can still find meaning, find purpose, rebuild your life.
It makes you think,
Yeah.
What if we all paid more attention to those little details?
Yeah, like the missed calls, the changes in someone's behavior, the signs that someone's hurting.
Could we stop bad things from happening?
Maybe. Or maybe we could just understand each other better.
It's about being more empathetic.
Exactly. Recognizing that we're all connected and that even small actions can make a big difference.
I like that. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the Endeavor Hills attack. But we'll be back soon with another episode, something that'll make you think, challenge your ideas, and help you understand the world a little bit better.
We'll see you then.
Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep listening.